Okay, so week. Welcome to another week and this week we're doing civil rights and civil liberties, which you can find in chapters 4 and 5 of your government book. Uh, I want to welcome you guys, and as we prepare to delve into what civil rights and civil liberties are, I believe civil liberties will be chapter 4 and civil rights will be chapter 5. When we talk about civil rights and civil liberties, these are individual rights protected by the Constitution against the powers of government. Now, the difference between civil liberties and civil liberties are limitations on government actions. So this tells us what government can't do, okay? This is like government can't do certain things. Government can't stop your freedom of speech. Now, you can't doesn't mean you can say anything you want because you can't. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. You can't yell bomb at the airport. But you do have a right to criticize the government. May it be your state, federal, local being county, or your municipal, which is your city government. Civil rights specify what the government must do. Government must protect the rights of minorities. Okay, we're a nation that we're governed by the rules of the majority, but government's supposed to protect the rights of the minority, which are things like gay marriage, marriage equality. Yeah, government's job is to protect the rights of the minority, which are LGBTQ individuals in their community. When we talk about protections under the First Amendment, we talk about freedom of religion, which under the freedom of religion, that means you can practice any religion you want. It's your right, as long as you don't hurt anybody else. Freedom of expression, you can express yourself any way you want, as long as you don't hurt anybody else. And then freedom of the press. The press has the right to report the news. They have a right to report what's factual. Okay. Now, just because something is factual doesn't mean it's necessarily the truth. But if it's factual, right, it's true in that moment because you can come back later and find out that that thing that was true, which was factual, might come back later and not be factual. So there's a difference between truth and factual. Truth will always be truth. You cannot change the truth. The earth is round is the truth, right? No matter what Shaquille O'Neal says about it being flat. The earth is round. It will always be round. Now, somebody you can say, right? You can say like O.J. Simpson is innocent, or O.J. Simpson was found guilty by reasonable doubt of murdering two individuals. Now, just because the fact is he was found not guilty by reasonable doubt doesn't mean the fact is the truth is he could have killed those people. We don't know, and we'll never know. Okay, so when we talk about truth is well, you can never change the truth. It just is what it is. Facts can always change. When we talk about freedom of religion, we talk about laws on religion in the colonies. So let's talk about these laws on religion in the colonies. Freedom of religion was first freedom mentioned in the Bill of Rights, and the colonists showed little tolerance for religious freedoms. When you look at the colonies, when you first came to America, when early Americans came, the colonists left the UK or England for a new land so they can practice their religions. What they found was that, like, when you went to Pennsylvania was a Quaker colony. Quakers tend to do things different than those in Massachusetts who were Puritans. Or even if you go down to the Carolinas where they tended to be Catholic. Every religious group, depending on which colonies they were in, that was the religion of that colony, and they weren't very kind to people who did not believe what they believe, and we still kind of do that today, right? We frown a nose at those who don't believe what we believe. The good thing about the colonists was they did the Establishment Clause, which protects Congress from passing laws respecting established religion. So we do not have an established religion. It does not prohibit government from supporting religion in general, though. Now, government can support a religion, but government doesn't get to say we have a national religion. Now, even though every U.S. president has claimed to be a Christian, that doesn't mean much, right? What it really means is what it really means is that that the government can support religion in a way that it can say, people who belong to this religion can meet freely and worship their God any kind of way they want. The Supreme Court upholds the wall of separation between church and state. So it's the job of the Supreme Court to make sure church and state is never, those lines are never blurred. Now, some of us might disagree with that in this day and age, but that's what the theory of all of this is. When we talk about freedom of religion, we're talking about prayer in schools. Any religious or non-denominational prayer is unconstitutional in public schools. So remember that. Supreme Court ruled that public schools cannot sponsor religious activities. They used to do these little baccalaureates where in high school, when you get ready to graduate, they would have this gathering where they would pray for the students. Well, the Supreme Court ruled that was unconstitutional, so they got rid of that back in the 90s. So, which tends to offend people because a lot of people want prayer in schools because they used to pray in school. The problem is, what if you're a Christian and the teacher is, let's say, a Muslim or a Sikh? Do you want them praying with your children? Think about those things. When we talk about the Constitution, we're also talking about a right to privacy. This is implied in the Constitution and part of your constitutional rights. These are guaranteed in your First, Third, Fourth, Fifth, and Ninth Amendments. So it's kind of important because it's talked about quite a bit. Congress and the courts acknowledge a constitutional right to privacy. Now, the nature and scope of the right are not clear. As we have to understand with our Constitution, the Constitution is like the Bible. It can be very vague, and people get different things out of both texts, right? You read something, you read it one way. The Supreme Court reads something, they read it one way. Plessy versus Ferguson is a good example of that. When in the late 1890s, the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal was constitutional. You fast forward about 60 years to the 1950s, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal is unconstitutional. What changed in that time? The Supreme Court changed, right? And so you had more liberal judges on the court who ruled that that separate but equal is not constitutional, and it's because separate but equal is not constitutional. You end up having this thing where you had this thing with your schools being desegregated. And then you have other people. You have people standing in schoolhouse doors, yelling "segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." Well, Supreme Court ruled it was unconstitutional. Therefore, that governor who stood in the Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, was breaking the law. So what ends up happening is, because Justice Warren and the 9 justices ruled that separate equals unconstitutional, Eisenhower federalizes the state militia, which we call the National Guard, and he sends them home. So the only time the federal government and the president can nationalize or federalize the National Guard is when the governor is breaking the law. So then he sends them home. He sends in the 101 Army Airborne to police Little Rock, Arkansas. This is kind of a big deal because they hadn't seen the military in an American city, police in an American city, since the end of the Civil War and the beginning of Reconstruction. Okay, so when we're talking about these different cases and you see like the Supreme Court rule on these issues, it's because the justices changed. And Earl Warren, just so you know, was the former governor of California. And so he's also a Supreme Court justice. He was very liberal. Right to privacy, when we talk about abortion and the right to die. Abortion and privacy. Right of abortion includes a woman's decision whether or not to terminate her pregnancy. This is Roe v. Wade. States can impose certain regulations to safeguard the health of the mother. When we talk about partial birth abortions, these are procedures used during the second trimester of pregnancy. Now, let's be clear when we talk about partial birth abortions. When we're talking about partial birth abortions, we're talking about women whose lives are endangered, not just some woman who went out partied and she got pregnant and she decided, oh, I'm going to wait till the 22nd week to do this partial birth abortion. Let's be clear on that because I think sometimes in the media they tend to minimize and trivialize people's experiences and why they're doing what they're doing. Partial birth abortion ban act happened in 2003. State laws permitted assisted suicide are not considered. Now, what we saw in California as well as Washington was that they have passed laws that allow for assisted suicide by medical professionals, but it's usually people who are terminally ill and have no chance of survival. When we talk about right to privacy and personal information, the Personal Information Freedom of Information Act of 1966, the Privacy Act of 1974, the Driver's Privacy Protection Act of 1994. What reason why you have these was that people tended to get information, and you would and seriously, like the Privacy Act of 1974. Reason why they went into effect because there was a crime, somebody died, because you would be able to get information on people. People used to call the DMV and get their information, and people would go to people's houses, and how are you finding these people? Well, DMV would tell you. Also, for students, there's the FERPA, which is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. And this basically, this is a federal law that governs the access to educational information and records by public entities, such as potential employers, public funded educational institutions, and foreign governments. This protects you as students from, and even if you're a minor student, your parents don't have access to your grades. And so I cannot tell your parents or anybody else what your grade is. You have to do that. Okay. Also, we have the healthcare providers and insurance companies are restricted from sharing your information, which is kind of important. Victims online harassment. There have been people, and now we live in a day and age where a lot of us put all our information online, and we're harassed, and so and when you're harassed, you can pursue those things and sue people in civil court. When we talk about personal privacy and national security, the Patriot Act of 2001 allows government to investigate people who are vaguely associated with terrorists. And you guys got to be careful with the things you're saying online and on the phone. They're trigger words, and they listen for them. Now, the government doesn't have the infrastructure to listen to all of us, but when you say trigger words, when you send emails that are outlandish to people, yeah, they will investigate you. The FBI was authorized to demand personal information about individuals from private companies, which you saw companies fight back. You had Apple who refused to open up the phones after the San Bernardino shooters, right? And so they refused to open up the phone. So the FBI had to find another way to get into the phone. Reinstated the Bush policy. President Obama reinstated the Bush policy. Individuals who passed national security information to the press were charged and convicted. We saw this with Dick Cheney's chief of staff, Scooter Libby. He outed CIA agent Valerie Plame because her husband, who was a ambassador, I forgot, Ambassador Wilson, who worked under Bill Clinton, wrote an article that was a scathing article about the Bush administration and their war in Iraq, and he wasn't for it. Scooter Libby outed Valerie Plame to a Washington Post reporter, and once the government got involved, he got arrested. He did jail time, and Donald Trump ends up later on pardoning Scooter Libby. When we talk about civil rights, Civil rights are of all Americans to equal treatment under the law. Now, when most of us hear about civil rights, we think about black people. We hear about the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks. But civil rights are for everybody. It's for LGBTQ. They're for Asian Americans. They're for Hispanic Americans. They're for people of different religions. But they're also for white women. Um, I think a lot of times when we talk about privilege and everything, we forget that white women don't necessarily always have privilege. They get privilege through their husbands. So that's when we're talking about privilege in the sense of white male privilege. Okay, there's different types of privilege, and we can have that debate later because I know some people might feel a little certain way because we're talking about this, but there is white privilege in America, and but there's lots of different types of privileges. So and I want to be clear on that when I say white privilege, I'm talking about white male privilege. You can find the civil rights to be provided by the 14th Amendment. You have the Equal Protection Clause, which is Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, and basically says no state shall deny any person within its jurisdiction equal protection of the laws. So when we talk about civil rights, we're talking about women's rights, we're talking about African American rights, Asian American rights. We're talking about rights of all Americans. Even white males have civil rights. You cannot violate people's civil rights. Okay, if you do, you end up brought up on charges. So when we're talking about civil rights and civil liberties, remember, civil liberties talks about what government can't do. Government cannot quarter soldiers in your house. Government cannot hinder your freedom of speech. Civil rights says what government must do. Government must protect the rights of all minorities. Thank you. That's all I have for today. Again, this is 2 chapters, so be aware this will be for this week and next week lectures. So next week I'll just be uploading assignments. If you have any questions, please go to Canvas. Thank you and have a great day.